Hello and welcome to Books and Beyond. My name is Jimmy Bennett and I'm your host. Books and Beyond is a show where we try to help people personify their aspirations, authors, writers, illustrators, anybody that has anything to do with the written word. This week I have a very special guest and I will get to him in one moment. I have a couple announcements to make. I'm also co-chairman of the Southeastern Connecticut chapter of the Connecticut Authors and Publishers Association, which is a wonderful group that we support each other and encourage new writers. We are open to the public. Anybody can join. Of course, now during this pandemic, things have changed. We don't have meetings in person in Meet Space, but we do have a virtual Zoom meeting once a month, and that's on the third Monday of every month at 6:30. Our next meeting will be July 20th at 6:30. You can find the link to it on the Southeastern Connecticut and Authors Publishers Association webpage or Facebook page. And I'll also announce it on my Facebook pages. Last month we had a writing contest. Our winner was Greg Gilmartin, a very talented writer in our group. And next month we have another contest, and this is for children's books. So all you members out there, get writing and see if you can do something a little outside your purview. All right, now my next guest, Roy Bourque. I have to apologize to him. He was supposed to be a guest in my studio show back in March. But then, of course, the pandemic hit and everything changed. Been waiting. We were hoping to get back, but it's going to be a while. We have to be safe. We got to be smart. So, but he has graciously accepted to do this Zoom interview with me today. And Roy has written a book called The Merging of Two Worlds, which is really a fascinating concept. So right now I'm going to let Roy, I want to show you, there's a picture of the cover of the book. And now I'd like to introduce Roy Bourque. Roy, how are you? Welcome to the show.
I am good this afternoon, Jim.
Okay, so Roy, before we get into the meat of your book, can you tell me a little about yourself? How you got started, how you became a writer?
Well, I was in Sunday school about the age of 9, asking a lot of questions, difficult questions for the Sunday school teachers. I ended up finding myself at Mother Superior's office, and she said the questions I'm asking can only be answered by God, and I needed to get alone with God and ask him the questions and let him answer. And she says, "Do you understand what I'm telling you?" And I said, "I think so." And she says, "Well, okay then." And when I walked out of the church, I realized that they weren't refusing to answer my questions, but they really didn't know. So a couple of weeks later, I had a personal experience while meditating on God, and I was aware that all of nature is reducible to a common denominator, and that common denominator is what is doing the creating. And if I wanted to know about God, that's where I needed to start my search. So I went back to Sunday school and I told them what I had experienced, and they said, "Well, sounds like the devil's putting ideas in your head," because I was questioning some of their concepts. And then I went to my secular school teachers and they said, "Well, it sounds like you're having a mental breakdown. You may need to see a shrink." And so I realized I wasn't going to get any help from either one of those. It was 11 years later in a nuclear physics class that the instructor said something that would open the doors. He said, "Every electron in the universe is the same, every proton is the same, every neutron is the same, and these three particles essentially make up everything else." And as soon as he said that, my experience from 11 years earlier just suddenly came to life. And so that's when I started thinking about, what does this all mean? And then it was within 6 months, I was ready to be an atheist, because everything that I now knew about the universe, I could explain scientifically. But these spiritual experiences kept, teasing me about, well, what is that all about? So I had several more spiritual experiences, and they would help me to see things in a whole different light. And I started realizing that there is maybe a way to integrate science and religion. Right now, they were totally opposed to each other, or appeared to be. And then, as time went on, I began to see the connections. I think the final thing that brought it together was I was in a psychology class, and they talked about the split brain. And they said the brain has two hemispheres, and each hemisphere thinks differently. And when they explained how each one thought, I said, that's the key. Religion is all based on right brain concepts, but the scientific method is based on left brain concepts. So is it possible that there is actually two different ways of seeing the world? And if you didn't get the information wrong, that they could coincide. And so that started a research project that lasted for years to try to answer that question. And that finally culminated in the book.
Wow. Okay. So, that is a fascinating concept, merging science with religion. I too grew up in the Catholic school system. So there was a lot of conflicts. And did your faith suffer the more you learned science, or did it grow stronger, or?
I would have to say that it evolved. It was almost like a metamorphosis. It changed from what it started out to be. Because my original faith was based on what the church taught me. And now I'm seeing God in a whole new light. And it's getting bigger and more powerful. And it's starting to assume the entire universe. So when I saw God, I didn't see it as this person who lives in Never Never Land. I saw it as part of the universe itself.
Right.
So my faith grew stronger that way. And then it was a question of, well, are the teachings of the church, are they based on something that I can actually show? And that's where my research says they are.
Well, did you, now, I don't want to put you on the spot or anything, but have you thought of the correlation? I mean, I know one of the biggest rifts between the scientific community and the religious community is creationism and evolution.
Definitely did look at that. And what I realized is that evolution is a creative process. So now the question is, what's driving the process? And the evolutionists say that it's a random process. But that's one area that I disagree with. Let me give you an example. DNA changes is what's necessary to make one person another. And yet they know that things like radiation and drug abuse can cause birth defects. And so I said, well, if DNA changes are purely random, why should it matter what causes them? And so that brings out a question. Does the cell know what it's doing? Or is it just some haphazard concept that deaf, dumb, and blind? And I don't think cells are deaf, dumb, and blind. So that's where I integrate the idea that there's a process here going on that we really don't understand.
All right. Well, that makes sense. I know that a lot of people don't, they take, strict views. They take either the left or the right, and I like the way that you're saying that there is a middle ground here where things actually blend and one thing can explain the other. I myself, I mean, there's a few times in my life I've had a few revelations about even some of the recorded biblical events, right? The Great Flood. They've already established that in the time of Noah, sea levels rose very, very high and flooded most of the known world. Now, was it the same as described in the Bible? No, but from a certain point of view, their world did flood. And that's been proved by all sorts of settlements and cities and stuff that they found, deep underwater. And also my second one is, and I don't know if you had touched on this at all in the book, but when Moses led his people out of Egypt and they came to the Red Sea, at that time, they've already proved this, astronomers and scientists have proved that at that time there was extreme perigee tides where the Red Sea would have drained enough that you could actually wade across it. And then when they were followed by the Egyptian army, of course, the tide came back in and drowned them. Was it I don't know if it was I won't say whether it was just a scientific fact or whether or not it was orchestrated by a higher power, but the coincidence is pretty incredible, isn't it?
Well, that is one of the interesting concepts, is that a lot of things are based on what they call God's timing. Just because there may be a natural reason for it doesn't mean that there isn't a higher power orchestrating these events. So that's why I say in terms of evolution, can we actually say that everything that happens in evolution is purely random, or is there a higher power orchestrating these events and we simply aren't aware of it? We go to string theory and they say there may be as many as 11 dimensions. Well, we don't know 11 dimensions, nor do we know how they incorporate themselves into the world we live. So there's a lot going on behind the scenes that we still don't know. So those are the concepts that I try to, dwell upon, that says science helps us to understand the laws of the cosmos, but that doesn't mean that God doesn't exist. It may be that God is different than what we're familiar with, the current definition.
And you have done some incredible research for this book, haven't you?
Well, yes, because I couldn't just pick up on one religion. I find that, ideas from different religions help you to understand where something else is coming from. Let me give you an example. I was watching Cosmos by Carl Sagan, and he was talking about a Hindu motif called Shiva, the Lord of the Dance. And he said in his right hand was a drum, and in his left hand was a flame. And the drum was the sound of creation, and the flame was the flame of destruction. And it's like creation is on the right side, and destruction is, as time moves through space, the old disintegrates, and then it becomes part of the new. And so when Jesus said, I go to the right hand of the Father, I says, now it makes sense to me. He's going to where creation is taking place. So I find a lot of correlations from different religions. I studied Eastern philosophy, mysticism, mythology. I read Joseph Campbell's book, The Power of Myth. And I find that so many different correlations that when you open that door to say, other religions are valid as well, now you can start to find the stuff that to help understand, why did they say that? What did it mean? I mean, in the book of Exodus, it says that Moses was raised in the house of Egypt and that he married the daughter of a Midian priest, which is part of Babylon. So when I looked at Egyptian and Mesopotamian myths, John Romer in his book Testament talks about how these myths actually played in how the story of Genesis and Exodus evolved. So many of those ideas actually come from previous writings.
All right. I've heard that also on a more general level, that a lot of the different religions do borrow from each other, or have roots in other beliefs. And one of the things that you had said that I really found just really fascinating was that although there are many, many different religions, beliefs, and mysticism, as you said, philosophies, and separately, not all of them make sense and conflict with each other. But when you put them all together, it forms a worldview that shatters misconceptions that have evolved over the centuries.
I found that each time I studied something, it was like the piece of a puzzle. And so I said to myself, well, let's assume that we're putting a puzzle together. How do we do it? And the first thing we do is we look for the pieces with the straight edges because we know where they go. And we know that the ones with two straight edges, those form the corners. So we have a definite place. And so when I looked at religion and science, I said, what do I truly know to be true? And those became the pieces with the straight edges. And then I started piecing all the other ones in between. And eventually they form a worldview that starts to make sense. And that's how I built the puzzle. It was taking all these pieces and then fitting them in where they go. And I suddenly started to see the big picture. And it was quite a thing. Once your mind finally focuses on it and says, wow, this is really taking it to where you can understand how they are all interrelated.
I think that one of the things I've been getting out of this conversation with you today, and I see that you grow up with a certain belief, a religious belief you're taught from a child. And I think many people focus on that one point of view because that's the way they were taught. And sometimes people just dismiss it, or they lose their faith, or they just set it aside because they don't think it affects them on a day-to-day basis or whatever. But not enough people, and very few people, I think, really go and study other religions to see if there are similarities or big discrepancies. And how did you find, there's things that you found in your research that, like I said, really butted heads with each other unless you put them all together in the big picture?
Well, actually, a lot of how I saw the big picture was through spiritual experience. I was looking for information. Somebody had recommended that I go to a New Age bookstore. So I walked into the bookstore and I went to the clerk and I told her what I was looking for. And she brings me over to the philosophy section and shows me a book on Eastern philosophy. And I open this book and I start reading my own thoughts. And I said, okay, this is a good place to start. But it's like I kept finding things that way, is that the Spirit would guide me to different places that would answer the questions I was asking.
Well, I mean, so as the book evolves or the book goes on, how do you present these ideas? Do you understand what I'm saying? What's your, how does that flow?
Well, the book is divided into 12 chapters, and each chapter is sort of a subject in itself. But each one is building a dialogue concept that helps you to see the larger picture. So the first chapter talks about the split brain concept, how I came to see it, and what that's all about. The second chapter goes into how beliefs can change over time, and the mind responds to beliefs whether they're true or not. And I use the story of when Orson Welles broadcasted War of the Worlds on CBS radio in 1938. He set a whole county into panic because they actually believed what he was saying. and there wasn't a bit of truth to it at all. But
Right.
that didn't matter. They believed it and they responded to it, and the end result was quite astounding. Even Orson Welles was amazed at how people responded to this. The property damage, there were suicides, there were miscarriages, there was all kinds of stuff that went on that night. And people actually claimed to have seen the Martians, even though there weren't any. So once you put that thought in a person's head, unless they really think about it, it's the power of suggestion. And I find that in the power of suggestion, that's where you really have to question things, because we're taught not to question, but you need to. So even though they say don't question, Jesus said, you know, the blind lead the blind, and both will fall into the ditch. So it's very important that you do question. It was through questioning. Yeah, it was through questioning that I actually found the answers I was looking for.
I understand what you're saying. I met a lot of opposition myself. I spent a few bad trips down to Mother Superior's myself. I was always questioning too, and most of the time I was told, you know, that I just needed to strengthen my faith, not, you know, my knowledge. Which I'm glad. I'm really happy to see this put together like this, and I can't wait to see how it all shapes, how you shaped it all together. I think it's a fascinating concept. But how about other religious people? Have you had any experiences with your book with a Roman Catholic priest or a Protestant minister or a shaman or a Muslim cleric? Or
I haven't actually got to that point of talking to clergy. I do go to a spiritualist church now, and quite a few people have purchased the book, and they said they really like it. I gave a speech at a Unitarian Universalist church. Several people bought the book there, and they said, these are very interesting ideas. So I am getting feedback there. The book is available on Amazon.com, and there are numerous, I think 5 reviews of people who read it, and they some good comments.
Good.
And I've had, you know, people tell me personally that they really thought that the way the book is presented, that it has a lot of good information, and it really makes you think, and that was the whole concept. It makes you think.
Now, what about now in modern times? I mean, even since we were children, Roy, religion has changed in ways, or at least the way people have worshipped, or what they believe now. Or, I mean, things are changing, and a lot of people feel like the church doesn't keep up with the times. Do you think that they need to embrace the science a little bit more, address some of those issues?
Well, if you have to choose between science and religion, most atheists will choose science. So if you can integrate the two, that's the only way you're going to get the atheist into taking another look at this. But a lot of what science is teaching helps us to understand the laws of the cosmos. And the law of God and the laws of the cosmos, in my mind, are one and the same. So science can reinforce the principles of the teachings of religion. Religion is more in terms of a moral compass than it is how the universe works. So it is actually 2 different ways of seeing the world. How the world works doesn't necessarily mean you're going to make the right choices. There's a lot of people learn things the hard way, and there's no reason why they need to. But so the idea is that you have the laws of the cosmos on one side, and you got a moral compass on the other, and you really need both.
Well, I think that's a very good point. Though I have to say that over my lifetime, some of the absolutes and things that I was taught in Catholic school, I just don't I just don't believe in. I think they were hard-lined, wrong, archaic. But I also believe that there is a, like you say, everybody does need a moral compass. And I feel that it's good that people, if not practice religious all the time, but they keep that moral compass in their head. I mean, really, it all to me, everything comes down to the same thing. The one saying of Jesus, do unto others as you'd have them do unto you. And that's, that doesn't have a scientific basis, but it's really a nice way to live.
Well, when Jesus talked about the separation of the sheep from the goats, it had nothing to do with what they believe. It was totally based on how you treated one another. So
Right.
The people that helped each other out, well, they were going to heaven. And the people that were bucking heads, well, guess what?
Yep.
Hope you like the heat.
So do you think in the future, as science progresses, we're learning new things all the time, and there's, the universe is opening up to us, and I'm sure it's just a small percentage of the universe, but we still know much more now than we did even 50 or 100 years ago. So do you think this will, as science progresses, do you think it will also help prove that there is a controlling force in the universe, that there is a God?
I think it will. Well, just like with myself, my concept of God went through a change. I actually had to say, what is God? And the experience I had at 9 says it's not a male deity, and it's not separate from reality. It's integrated with reality. And actually everything that exists is a part of God. So God doesn't work for us. God works through us. We become the channels through which God works. And that's how I think it's going to have to be discovered, is that we're co-creators with God. We're part of the process. I mean, in Genesis, it says God ended his work. Well, that's because he passed the torch on to us. And what we do with the world that he gave us, well, we inherit the world that we helped to create.
I do agree with you, Roy. We're coming up to the end. Now, I just wanted to bring up, you have another book coming out, right?
Yes, it's called We Believe, and it basically talks about the evolution of the Christian church.
Oh, all right, great.
But it also integrates it with science and religion. But it's basically about, when Jesus talked about the Holy Spirit, that is the awakening of the higher faculties of the mind, allows us to see things more clearly.
All right. Well, when that comes out, Roy, I'll have you back on, and I'd like to discuss that book with you again. You put a lot of questions in my mind, but we don't have enough time to get into them all today. I want to thank you so much, Roy. This was great, very interesting, very thought-provoking. I encourage everybody to go out and check out your book. You take care, and we'll see you next time.
Thank you very much for having me, and have a good day.